Hello and welcome, I'm Tafara Gadamu. A young professor at an Ivy League college sailing across the racial divide and a very keen observer of Ethiopian art and literature, my guest today, Dr. Dagmawi Woubshet, remains to be one of the articulate scholars on a great number of issues. Well, today he joins me for our conversation on topics that matter to Africans in the continent and in the diaspora. Well, welcome to the program, Dr. Dagmawi.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I know that you've studied American literature.
Yes.
And you're teaching some of these courses at Cornell. But that aside, what makes you feel like that you have to tell stories and be able to kind of...
Well, I had a kind of circuitous route to literature. I was not a big literature person when I was a child. I was not a big reader. In fact, in college I studied political science and history with the intention of becoming an international diplomat. And then late in my undergraduate career as a junior, I took a literature class for the first time, and it blew me away. I had this old sense of, an English class, a literature class, that all you did was Shakespeare or you did some romantic poets. And this was a class on contemporary African-American literature. And I didn't know that literature could be all-encompassing, that, studying literature meant thinking about social and political thought. It meant thinking about the most, intimate and interior personal thoughts. And it had a way of really opening up the world for me. And I think since then, I've just been absorbed with what literature can do. As you said, what telling stories can do. I think, storytelling, narrative, it's the oldest and most fundamental human act that we have. In fact, one of my favorite writers, Toni Morrison, says, it is the one thing that distinguishes us from other species. Other species also love their offsprings, but we are one species that has the facility of storytelling.
To express ourselves as a species.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, when you think about it, in terms of how we commune with God, how we arrange our laws, our constitutions, that process of narrative, that process of conveying what we mean, our intentions, through language, it's the binding human act. So it encompasses, narrative encompasses all the things that we do as human beings.
So you are interested in telling stories. I know some of the conversations that you had with Ethiopian filmmakers, writers, and photographers who somehow relate themselves to Ethiopia. It's a very interesting narrative because it takes you back in time, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Is that what your interest was when you tried to embark on this conversation with those figures?
Yes, indeed. Well, part of it for me, in terms of the kind of stories I'm interested in, on the one hand, I study and, I'm a scholar of African-American literature. So on the one hand, I'm interested in telling the stories of black people in the diaspora, in the New World, in the United States, in the Caribbean. It's one of my interests, the stories I'm interested in. On the other hand, I'm interested in telling Ethiopian stories, right? And it's a way of, that's how we bridge our differences, right? That if I learned something about you, and if you learn something about me, then that's how we can bridge our differences and, arrive at common denominators.
Have you been able to identify that common denominator when you kind of look into African-American literature,
yes,
in the Caribbean and Ethiopian?
Yes, I think so. I think, I think there are a lot of common denominators, in fact. One would be, I actually think both are exceptional people. If I were to take African Americans as a kind of distinct category of people, when you think about it, African Americans are only, 13% of the U.S. population, right? But they are central to that country, to its culture, to its laws, to its literature, right? And they, as a small minority, they were able to transform, one of the great modern states, modern countries. And in the same way that Ethiopia has been, not only in terms of the kind of its extraordinary historical legacy, but even if we look at modern Ethiopia in terms of as the emblem of Pan-Africanism, it's an exception, right? If we think of Adwa, if we think of the way in which Ethiopian independence has been prized by Africans all over, black people, the world over, Ethiopia is also a very exceptional country.
But we are detached, aren't we?
Indeed, we are detached. But that's precisely why the narratives matter, right? It's precisely a way of bridging by identifying these common denominators. It's a way of showing that actually we are more alike than we think, And part of it is the detachment that you talk about. And this is the case in terms of Ethiopians in the diaspora. When you are you grow up with your own cultural traditions and you go to a different country, it's easy to distance yourself based on differences. And I think what I find most fascinating is instead of using one's difference to divide, we can use difference actually as a way to bridge these different gaps, historical gaps, cultural gaps.
Ethiopians started flocking west side,
yes,
I would say, in the last 40 years.
Indeed.
En masse.
Indeed.
That tells a story, doesn't it?
Absolutely, no doubt about it. And Ethiopians and other Africans too, right? So there's a huge diaspora population of Nigerians in the United States, Ghanaians in the United States, Ethiopians in the United States. Part of that is we couldn't have, Africans couldn't go to the United States en masse prior to the 1960s because of segregation, right? The laws were so cruel and severe that, if one were a black person in the United States, one would have to drink from a different facility, live in a different quarters, white-black quarters. In fact, there's a great poem, Bashashabr B'Amerika, by Mengistu Lemma, when he traveled to the United States during segregation. He's in Washington, D.C., he goes into a cafe, and the waiters look at him askance. What is this black man doing in this cafe? We're not going to serve him. And he couldn't fathom, proud Ethiopian walking into a cafe and he can't be served because of his skin color. And so the kind of civil rights movement had enabled the law, the laws were transformed, had enabled, created a space for us, for Ethiopians and other Africans, to actually go into the new world and thrive and succeed.
Well, yeah, what you talked about earlier on about Mengistu Lemma, the problem that an Ethiopian migrant had to run into.
Yes.
In the United States way back in the 60s when there was so much segregation. I mean, the fact that whole perception, don't you think that it has permeated into the Ethiopian psyche, to the Ethiopian diaspora today in the United States? And in other words, that would never allow us to kind of jump into a common denominator that we have with other African Americans.
Absolutely. Part of it is, if I were to be critical of Ethiopians in the diaspora, is that, we have our own biases that we have in this country and we take them there and we, and they're in relief there. So, something I'm critical of Ethiopians sometimes in the diaspora is that we arrive there and then we say, oh, these black people, we're not black. We're Ethiopian. We're exceptional. Look at these black people. Look at these putting down African Americans. But that is, not just a disservice to the kind of struggle that African Americans have waged to enable themselves, empower themselves, but also other black people who've migrated to the United States. And I have to say this too, that category of black American is so wide, is so encompassing, that it includes black people who've been in the United States for several generations, but also people like me, or somebody who's gone from Ghana, someone who's gone from Nigeria. And I can't think of, for instance, other identities that are so wide and embracing that have allowed all of us black people in that country, to come under one organizing identity.
But the people that you've talked to in the conversations that you organized, like people like Haile Gerima, Maza Mengiste,
Yes.
who a published author, and Andreas Ishetio has been for many years in the U.S., but back here, the thought process is very interesting, and they are more accommodating.
Yes.
But they are the insignificant few.
Yes.
In terms of working on that narrative.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. Yeah, exactly. I don't want to exaggerate the point. It's a few of us, and part of it is it's going to change with the new generation, right? So Ethiopians have been in the U.S. for, let's say, about 40 years. Now all of a sudden you have Ethiopians born and raised in that country, and even though they know of Ethiopian identity within the family, they're part of their experience is also as black Americans because they're being reared in that country.
But that's going to change the
country.
narrative, right?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. I think, and I have cousins, for instance, my aunt's children, my uncle's children, born and raised in the United States, and they identify themselves as Ethiopian American, and they take pride in their Ethiopian heritage. But, the idea of Ethiopia is not as textured as mine, for instance, who grew up in this country and then went to the United States. You see what I mean? A lot of their narrative is they know about Ethiopia through stories or through in the household, culturally, through and so on and so forth. But if you were to ask them, tell me the scent of what September feels like in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, tell me about how the intensity of the sun. Tell me about, you see what I mean? They don't have that kind of textured or intimate interior sense of this country, even though they are Ethiopian nonetheless.
Was it easy for you as an Ethiopian who was born here and grew up here and moved to the U.S. To blend into the American?
It was initially very difficult because I left for the United States in 1989 and went to a small boarding school. And in the 80s, the overriding image of Ethiopia was the famine. So 84-85 famine set the discourse with which Ethiopia was hailed all over the United States. So when we went to boarding school, initially the kids were, wow, you're from Ethiopia and you're not,
And you are here in one piece?
You are, that's exactly right. They literally could not believe it because all they saw on American media was famine, famine, famine. And that was the only way through which they could view Ethiopia. So initially it was difficult because, and for my brother and I, we were shocked because, our sense of Ethiopia was, this is a great country. Sure, it has its difficulties. It may be poor, but it's culturally rich. We had an extraordinary upbringing in this country. So we were also confronting that image of Ethiopia for the first time abroad. You see what I mean? So initially it was a bit of a transition. And also the barrier of language. I used to be terrified in class. So this is in the 8th grade. English class, my teacher would say, Dagmawi, it's your turn to read aloud. And I would start reading, and the kids would just erupt into laughter at my English, And I think part of my fascination with the language actually may be rooted there. When the kids would make fun of me silently, I would say, okay, now you laugh at me, but I'm going to beat you in your own language, And so I think maybe my fascination with the English language may have some roots in that.
A reaction to what?
In reaction, that sure, I'm a latecomer to the language, but part of, maybe it's the Ethiopian pride, I don't know.
So has the nature of that discourse changed now, you think?
I think so. And it's changed, I would say, for two reasons. One is, in part, because you have a huge influx of Ethiopians in the United States. You go to Washington, D.C., you go to Dallas, you go to Oakland, San Francisco. There is a sizable Ethiopian population in major American cities, right? So it's hard to view an Ethiopian as a stereotype as an American when you also have close friends who are Ethiopian, right? Who defy that stereotype. So one would be indeed the large Ethiopian population in the United States that's changed the perception of Ethiopians and Ethiopia. And the second would be, the image of Ethiopia also has changed in Western media. It's no longer the spectacle of famine with which we're constantly being viewed. So I would say that that idea is slowly changing. Although in Western media, the dominant paradigm, of course, of thinking about Africa is always impoverished, and so on and so forth. And it's always this external gaze of thinking about Africa, as opposed to looking at it from within and thinking of it as a much more complicated life that goes on in this continent, and not just reducing it to one easy, sensational figure of, the starving child, for instance.
So what you're basically saying is there is a need for a counter-argument, right?
No doubt about it. No doubt
Would
about it.
art play a significant role in this respect?
Huge. Huge.
But interestingly enough, all our literature is in one, or predominantly in one language, in Amharic.
Yes.
And the world doesn't know anything about our own way of looking at things. It's not helping in terms of bringing the counter-argument, is it?
You're right about that. And again, I would say that's changing in part. Now you have a new generation of Ethiopians writing in English and succeeding. So if just to name two people, if I think of Dinal Mengistu, who was recently awarded the MacArthur Genius Award, which is one of the most prestigious award an artist could receive in the United States.
One of the under 40 writers, which was put in the limelight by the New Yorker.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Maza Mengiste, whose book Beneath the Lion's Gaze was a notable book, by well received by critics and scholars alike.
And you probably may mention the other guy from Canada, who is Nagamaslik from the Hyena's Belly. But
absolutely.
There are 3 or 4 of them.
No, so what I'm saying is it's slowly changing in part because you have Ethiopians also writing in English. And the other thing is, you're right, unlike other African countries, our writers are not on the global stage. And part of that is because the singularity of our tongue, right? So our literature is in Amharic. And if you don't know Amharic, and we don't have enough translations of our great authors, right? So I think with more translations, maybe we could assume that stage. So, for instance, Nigerians have produced extraordinary Nobel laureates, so forth. In South Africa, it's the same. Kenya, we have someone like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka in Nigeria, Chinua Achebe, the late Chinua Achebe. Part of it is because they trade, or Kamarale in Cameroon in French, It's because they use a lingua franca. So because they write French, automatically they have a Francophone audience. Or or the Anglophone countries, if they write in English, all of a sudden they have an audience, an English audience. So I think part of the task of scholars, writers, in the field of literature, is to translate our texts, our precious texts, into these lingua francas, so the world can actually see all the riches that this country has.
Do you see a role for yourself here?
I do. And in the near future, I want to take up the work of translation, and there are some authors I actually particularly like. They meet my interests and my taste that I want to definitely translate, no doubt about it.
Also, you have 2 books in the pipeline. One of them, let me start with your new flower, a memoir.
Yes.
You are 36, but it has been quite an exciting life that you had. Pretty fast. You are associate professor at Cornell University at the age of 36. That was too fast. And I know there is a story to be told, but I feel somehow that you are too young to write that memoir now.
True.
Do you share my views?
Well, there's a vernacular expression in the States where it says, age is only a number. So, part of it is, it's not, sometimes memoirs have a way of, it's not to aggrandize. It's not that. Part of it is, again, just to tell the story of what it means to be in the diaspora, to inhabit two worlds. You know, I feel like two civilizations have produced me, an Ethiopian civilization and also an American civilization. And part of it is telling that story.
The divided soul, perhaps?
No, I don't think it's divided. I would say it's actually a privilege, truth be told. It's rare to experience and be shored up by two great civilizations. You know, I have the advantage of the resources of these two great countries, their culture, their texts, their people. You know, I'm deeply enmeshed in both countries. And it's trying to tell the story of how entangled those two are in one person. That's one of the goals. The other is also, I take the, you know, there's a line that James Baldwin says, one of my favorite authors, in fact, my favorite author. He says, the intellectual or the artist should be the disturber of the peace. And part of the role in writing is to provoke and raise, you know, some issues that don't necessarily get amplified in the public sphere. And I feel like I have that responsibility as an intellectual to, you know, to be a scholar and intellectual. It's not a popularity contest, right? You want to the best of your ability, you want to tell the truth. You want to provoke the society. You want to, you know, lift up how we think. You want to check where you see ignorance and fear being perpetuated. So part of my aim for writing it is actually also to be, in a modest way, bear witness to truths that we are afraid to tell.
Also a bit about race in America?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it.
Because you mentioned Baldwin. The other book that's in the pipeline is also Here Be Saints, James Baldwin, The Making of Late Society.
That's right. Again, Baldwin for me is an indispensable modern thinker in terms of the 20th century.
He was very bold.
Oh, extraordinary, extraordinary. And, you know, reading his work has really truly changed my life. You know, sometimes we get, you know, literature can do that. You gain courage, you know, you gain a certain kind of fierceness, boldness, you gain a kind of radical agency. And reading James Baldwin's work, how defiant he was in his own time, shores me up in a way that I hope I can be a fraction of his legacy.
You moved to the U.S., but he lived outside of the United States for many years.
Indeed.
Where is that
See, but that's exactly, you know, that's exactly why I also find Baldwin so fascinating. Sometimes he used to talk about his life as a transatlantic commuter. So this is a man early in life, in his 20s, moved to France, and France became one of his home. He spent a significant amount of time in Turkey, and truly a global figure, right? And what I love about Baldwin is he loved his American identity, his black American identity. That is in his marrow, that is in his bloodstream, right? But at the same time, he wasn't imprisoned by parochial nationalism.
In fact, it was a rejection, wasn't it? I mean, the fact that he moved to France and, of course, as you say, to Turkey.
Exactly.
For a number of years.
The deep racism of America, exactly, wouldn't allow him to be as an author, right? Because the racism was so stifling that as a black author, you couldn't be successful. You're always second class. You're always less than, right? And Baldwin said, I had to go to France to resist that kind of imposition, you see. But he became a global figure, and I think that's what we need today, if I have to say. And the legacy of James Baldwin matters to me so much, is that we need global citizens, right? We take our nationality seriously, we take our own national life seriously, but the world, as we know, in the age of globalization, is becoming increasingly closer and closer and closer. And what a global citizen allows you to do is transcend petty differences, right? So that I don't use my nationality or my ethnicity or my religion to put down another person, right? That my own difference can be, I have my difference, I come to the table, you have your difference, you come to the table, and we try to achieve something common, something new, something compassionate, you know. And his legacy will resonate if we are truly to achieve a global world. James Baldwin will be a guiding light.
Dr. Dagmawi, thank you very much
Oh,
for it. It was a pleasure.
Great pleasure. Thank you.